Okay, how's this? Sound good? Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I think it's been a little while since I've been before the council, and BDCP has certainly been working through some fairly difficult issues. So let me start by saying, fundamentally, our approach has been in February, late February, the planning process released some preliminary administrative draft documents, both on the conservation plan and the chapters of the CEQA NEPA documents. In the conservation plan, sort of the two new pieces of information and the big pieces of information were the description of the conservation measures themselves, which at the time included dual conveyance with a conveyance facility of 15,000 CFS. That was the capacity in 5 intakes, and a particular set of operational criteria. And that was issued with the analysis of not only how that size of a facility and its operations would affect positively or negatively fish species, but also how the remaining 21 conservation measures would also produce an effect on fish species. And that was a critically important document for us to get on the street. It really represented the first time in a long planning process, a complete analysis of all of the conservation measures and their anticipated effects on fish and wildlife species. I wanted to start there because what that also included was an analysis of the scientific uncertainty surrounding the effectiveness of different kinds of conservation measures. So, Mr. Chair, that kind of picks up on some of your questions earlier about, what is equivalency and what's sort of the species response to different kinds of measures, and how does that function with an adaptive management program if our common goal is to move forward with the right set of measures, incorporate new science into the process as we implement the plan and learn more so that we're wise about the dollars we're spending and we're getting the desired effect on the species that the plan needs to recover. So in response to that information, we did receive feedback from the state and federal wildlife agencies, the Department of Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Fisheries, and these became known as the red flag comments, which was generally looking at this analysis, what do you think of where we're headed? And that information is available on the plan's website. At the same time, we did receive some input from an independent science panel that picked up on some of the same issues. So over the course of the spring, the state and federal agencies spent a lot of time together determining how to revise the proposed project to respond to these red flag issues. And that really became the substance of the July 25th announcement, is what were the proposed revisions.
And the details were mostly in that July 16 staff
Correct.
Recommendation to the Secretary and the Governor that
That's
is
correct.
included in our packet. And members, if you haven't taken a look at it, it is worth reading. Not all the things in here were highlighted in the press statement,
Correct.
but many were. Mm-hmm. And it's is it a fair statement, Ms. Nemeth, that supplemental documents in BDCP will start to reflect the recommendations contained within this document?
Correct.
I understand there's more to come on top of that, but
That's right.
that was
That's
my
right.
assumption.
So the 55-page document that the chairman is referring to was essentially designed to focus on some of the key issues, that being the size of the facility and how it performs for fisheries and water supply, habitat restoration in particular, and other things that we felt like we needed to do to continue to advance the co-equal goals. It's not, the 55-page document is a creature, if you will, of this particular task from the state and federal governments. It's not a draft plan in and of itself. There's many more components of a draft plan. Some of those were touched on in detail by the previous presenter in terms of where the planning process is on providing a cost estimates and a financing plan, and really understanding that that financing plan is going to be part of the Department of Fish and Game's determination under NCCPA. So the 55-page document was focused on several areas. In terms of conservation measures, just to kind of give you a flavor, it focused on the conveyance facilities and its operations, and that's one conservation measure. That's 1 out of 22. It also provided some additional information on habitat restoration, which probably encompasses about 3 or 4 other conservation measures. So there's a lot of other things that the plan is proposing to do that aren't in there. But I think thinking about it this way in terms of where we are in our expression of meeting the co-equal goals set out for this particular planning process, the substance of the announcement turned on a couple of key features. One being the biological goals and objectives. The state and federal agencies had spent a lot of time over the last year really refining those. We have over 200 biological goals and objectives for the 57 different species that the plan is proposing to conserve. It's very ambitious, and we had a lot of important independent science input on those biological goals and objectives. And equally as important, those biological goals and objectives have been embraced as the mechanisms by which we measure our progress and set out the conservation measures to follow. So that was pretty important. I think that is the primary expression of this ecosystem restoration goal in the plan.
And these are represented, as I understand, in this 55-page document by the various pages labeled BDCP goal and then various codes.
Correct. Although
there may be others as well.
Yeah, with the one caveat that the ones included in the 55-page document were for the aquatic species. So
aquatic species only.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Primarily because we were focused on facilities and their operations, and the aquatic habitat restoration is part of the announcement for moving forward.
Randy?
The second piece of the announcement, of course, was this dual conveyance and the conveyance facility as envisioned by Governor Brown and Secretary Salazar. The proposal was to reduce the overall capacity to 9,000 CFS for a couple of reasons. One, from the fisheries perspective, getting better input from NOAA Fisheries about the degree of scientific uncertainty surrounding the size and number of intakes. And the proposal that we have on the table is for these 3 intakes to be constructed simultaneously, but performance testing and performance standards required for the fish screens and therefore the operations of the different intakes. So that was a key adjustment from a fisheries perspective to the proposal. The second adjustment, I think, was frankly the sheer footprint of a 15,000 CFS facility and the 5 intakes. So just fundamentally, the administration wanted to move to a facility size that it believed could do the job from a water supply reliability perspective and durability into the future with climate change and changing hydrology. And that's primarily why the administration moved forward with that facility size. The other key piece, and this is really why I've heard a lot about, is this a preferred alternative and what does that mean? But it is a work in progress, and the other key piece that was described was an approach to determining operations of that facility. So one thing I want to make very clear is that without that information, we can't submit an application. So without information about specific operating criteria, so that will need to be part of a draft plan, that will need to be part of an eventual preferred alternative.
Just on that, so that operational criteria would would spell out, I guess, in pretty detailed fashion that if you operated this way and this happened, that would be okay, but if this happened, it wouldn't be, and so you'd have to adjust the operations, or I guess it would relate to the species that would be covered under the conservation plan. Is that?
That's correct, and let me just make one more point, and then I think I'm going to get on a little bit more detailed explanation of what that means. And the other point is we do need to provide some sense of the yield of the project for the water agencies that will be talking to their boards, who will need to make the determination of whether or not this is the right investment for them, since we are working on a user pays principle for the conveyance facilities and associated mitigation. So we need to do that from everybody's perspective. So what the approach to operations is essentially to construct what we're calling a decision tree. And what that will do is test some discrete scientific hypotheses. The chairman is laughing because we had such a difficult time describing that succinctly, and then he gamely sent me a Wikipedia definition of decision tree. So you bring it down to basics.
It looks like the diagram of a DNA molecule done for a scientific doctorate dissertation. Yeah.
So what we are envisioning for the decision tree is looking at 3 sets of criteria that would be part of proposed operations for a facility, and testing out how they perform over the course of the next 15 years before the facility comes online. So primarily the criteria that we're looking at in the decision tree process are outflow criteria, and combined with the performance standards for the new intake facilities and outflow criteria for different sets of species, delta smelt and longfin smelt. That's the way that the planning process is proposing to do a couple of things. One, provide some sense of the water supply yield coming from the project, but 2, openly embracing the scientific uncertainties surrounding the effectiveness of water operations criteria, and constructing around that a collaborative and open science process that can help us make those determinations. So part and parcel to what's envisioned for the decision tree is an accelerated habitat restoration program. And that would put 30,000 acres of the aquatic habitat restoration that's proposed in place also in that time frame, in the first 15 years of the conservation plan. So those are kind of the nuts and bolts, I think, of some of the difficult issues that we were trying to work through, and generally in response to the red flag comments that we received from the regulatory agencies in March. Beyond that, we also, all other components of the announcement, as I mentioned, were the science program that needs to be fleshed out in quite a bit more detail. We are conferring with Dr. Goodwin and others about, in the community, about what they see as an effective structure to enable that science program. So that's going to be an important piece that we'll flesh out in more detail over the next couple of months. We also revised the approach to the governance structure, and I think provided quite a bit more clarity as to the roles of the regulatory agencies, ensuring that they maintain their discretion for making determinations, that the plan itself is in compliance, and that the plan itself is meeting the conservation needs of species and therefore in compliance. We've identified the group, the water, DWR and the Bureau of Reclamation and water agencies that would be identified as managing the implementation of the conservation plans, or managing compliance with their permit, but being very clear about the fishery agencies retaining their discretion over whether or not the plan is in compliance. Another piece that we have defined is the adaptive management team. Much of this plan, of course, its success is going to require the adaptive management of scientific uncertainty, and I think buy-in from a broader range of scientific experts, both from academia, from the environmental community, from the water user community, about the effectiveness of the conservation measures and how do we continue to adapt our biological goals and objectives based on the research and monitoring that's coming out of the program, and how do we invest our dollars in conservation measures that are effective. So that has also been identified, the adaptive management team. And then we also, I think, defined with a finer point our vision for a stakeholder council. It's about 40 members from all kinds of groups, including Delta counties and local Delta interests. Lots of different governmental agencies, water users, environmental organizations that would have a role in providing input into the implementation of the plan. The vision is that that stakeholder council would meet quarterly to provide that kind of input. So that's that's the governance proposal as it now stands. We're still working on some dispute resolution portions of that. All that information would be reflected in our revised governance chapter. A couple more points that I did want to make that are, I think, important for folks to understand is the governor also embraced the notion that that we needed to think a little bit more broadly about water supply reliability and what it meant, and outlined, I think, in a very broad way, the need to continue investigations into storage, the need to continue our integrated water management plan. There were some commitments made by the two biggest urban water agencies to improve their water use efficiency over and above the 2009 requirements. Those, I think, are also important pieces, and we'll be, as we're revising and refining this decision tree and getting that information available for the public review draft, we'll also continue to develop, I think, with a finer point what water supply reliability means and what other programs we need to essentially retool and refocus so that it's supporting a Delta fix, and that a Delta fix itself is supporting smarter water management across the state. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about the path forward or where we are.
Okay, questions. Randy?
Well, you brought up governance, and it triggered a thought in terms of after the project is permitted, where does the BDCP activity reside? Will it be Fish and Game? Will it be DWR? Will it be resources? Will it be what does that look like? Because ultimately, those that are opposed to any kind of conveyance fix demonize the project, but ultimately, where the real action is at is on the operational decisions. So, in terms of all of that, in terms of the follow-up, the adaptive management, and so on, there's an ongoing part of BDCP, and I'm just curious, where does that reside?
That's a good question, and the vision is that the plan would develop and would create an implementation office with the program manager that is responsive to the permitting agencies and the authorized entities, and that program manager would work in tandem with the science manager and the stakeholder group. They would be receiving the input from the stakeholder group, but it is envisioned as sort of a freestanding kind of implementation office, if you will. So it won't reside at DWR or the Department of Fish and Game per se.
And these may include the three outline groups, the permit oversight group, the authorized entity group, and the adaptive management team, whatever all is set up.
Correct.
I shudder to think I must have to learn new acronyms for structures, but there it is. Pat.
So the manager would be within resources agency?
The manager essentially would be set up in this new entity, the BDCP Implementation Office.
What would establish it?
This isn't particularly my area of expertise, but I would imagine that through the implementing agreement and the financial arrangements that are laid out in the implementing agreement that tier off the cost and financing structure, that would essentially establish the office. I think the previous presenter described that is something that's also required of implementation plans as they're submitted and approved. And that's the real contractual part of implementing the plan.
If it's a state's water system, why does it require legislation? And if not, what binds it to the state or holds the manager accountable to the agencies who have various responsibilities that you cited?
Well, I would imagine that within the implementing agreement, that will be an agreement that's signed by the multiple parties, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation included in that. So there would need to be some kind of interagency agreement that describes the process and the responsibilities of a particular program manager.
Well, do the Department of Fish and Game, for instance, or Department of Water Resources delegate authority to the manager?
No, there's no delegation of authorities envisioned by the implementation of the plan.
Then what would the manager do?
The manager would essentially create the program for actually implementing the plan. So the plan itself will establish in a fair amount of detail what needs to occur to maintain permit compliance on a year-by-year basis. So the program manager would be working with the U.S. Department of the Interior, National Marine Fisheries, State Department of Water Resources, and the Department of Fish and Game to essentially set that process up.
The only information that's yet been provided is on pages 4, 5, and 6 of this 55-page document, which is attachment 3 under agenda item 9. And the authorized entity group is DWR, Bureau of Reclamation, and if granted permittee status, a representative of public water agencies. That body is proposed to hire the manager, and that body is, which says here, be the primary entity responsible for program management and implementation of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Consultation or input with the permit oversight group, which is the fisheries agencies, and the adaptive management team, which I'm not quite sure yet what it is, but is there, but it's input consultation primarily. Right?
Correct.
Well, I thought Randy identified something important, which is the confidence that parties and the people of California would have in the operation of the system if and when changes are made, facilities constructed that would fulfill the representations made by BDCP and by the state of California. So knowing who's responsible, a contractor, a manager, however competent, is still a person hired to perform functions, but does the responsibility for compliance with the complicated operation of this system and the need, as you said, to adaptively manage it, and the controversies that are likely to ensue based on, conflicting views of operating it. Is that going to reside with the governor, with the Secretary of Resources, or with a variety of state and federal agencies?
It would reside with a variety of state and federal agencies because the regulatory agencies will need to determine that the permit itself, that the implementation of the plan is in fact in compliance with the incidental take permits.
I'll stay tuned.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Joe.
I just wanted to give an example. This is complex and it will take some time, I'm sure, for them to work out. But in the Interagency Ecological Program, you guys know Anka Mueller-Solger, who appears here from time to time, who is on our staff. She is the lead scientist for the IEP. IEP is a consortium of 7 different agencies. There are a number of other managers who help oversee her work, and my expectation is that BDCP itself will be no less complex than that, and figuring out that structure is going to take them some time, and figuring out how you get people hired, who's going to be hiring them, how they're going to be provided the support, authority, and responsibility, and how they'll be held accountable. That's all going to be a challenge.
But the Interagency Ecological Program, which has been around for more than 40 years, is not an operational management program. It's a research organization.
But they do a lot of monitoring. They have
do
an annual
monitoring,
budget of
but
$20 million.
Well, sure, but they don't push the buttons on the water supply
That's
system.
True. That is true.
They don't operate and manage the environmental activities that occur related to it. They observe and all of that. One of the things that's most important for those of us who are under the mandate of the co-equal goal is how do you achieve a co-equal goal in a divided federal-state water contractor system where everybody retains some of their own powers, mostly to say no over things they really care about. And that's a dilemma. That's just a giant dilemma. Randy's point was the right one, that and I think you're going to wind up with some substantial changes in the structure that you've outlined here. That's my personal opinion. I don't know what the structure precisely will look like, but I suspect it's going to look closer to a process which blends co-equal goals and, as the Secretary and the Governor said, places science in a role to both involve itself in the ecosystem and in the water export determinations of the process. And that makes everybody uncomfortable, but that's the way it's going to be headed if there's any chance of getting through this muddle. I understand how difficult it is because no agency wants to consider surrendering whatever authority they have, even if they theoretically think it might be a good idea.
So let me describe it a little bit this way and see if it helps. But so what's envisioned is that there would be an annual operations plan, which is how are you going to run the projects with the criteria specified by law as part of this permit. There will also be the annual plan for moving habitat restoration and some of the other stressor measures forward. And it's that combination of activities that constitutes a yearly work plan for BDCP and its implementation office. And on a fundamental level, the Department of Water Resources and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, as permit holders in this process, they are responsible for those things happening on time because they're all part of the permit. So that's how, in a sort of an abbreviated work plan, that's how it's envisioned to go forward. There will be a lot of research and monitoring that's incorporated into that effort. So when we're setting out the habitat restoration activities for the next year, 2 years into the 5-year window, you're also outlining what kind of monitoring and research needs to be done. I mean, all of that kind of information is absolutely going to entail heavy participation from the adaptive management team, which is looking at the biological goals and objectives and what kind of research, additional research is needed. Because frankly, some of the ways in which we monitor actions out there, it's not very good. It's not bringing information to the table that's actually actionable and useful. So I would imagine that the adaptive management team is very much engaged in how we're evaluating the whole suite of actions that the conservation plan is required to be doing on an annual, biannual, and five-year basis.
Okay. Well, I'd like to congratulate you. I hear you wrote the draft statement for the Secretary and the Governor. They accepted it with only a few grammatical changes. It was done a week in advance, and everyone said, gosh, there's not a problem at all. And so I'd like to congratulate you on that.
It happened just that way.
Yeah, I'm sure. And did you, in fact, give the Governor the suggestion of a colorful expression of his intent? That was a rumor I was unable to substantiate. No, you don't have to. Carla, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay.